Hello and welcome, everybody. This is the very last SMPTE webcast of 2019. Thank you for joining us. It is a SMPTE Standards block meeting update, and as I said, it is the last one. I need to just mute a speaker. Go ahead. Okay, and when I say speaker, I mean the electronic kind, not the speaking kind. Um, I am your host, Joel Welch, SMPTE's Director of Education. And for those of you that have been with us throughout the year, I do want to thank you for being with us and supporting SMPTE and SMPTE webcasts and SMPTE education. Hope you will join us for 2020 as well. If this is your first time, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the standards meeting updates. They are intended to be interactive webcasts summarizing the activities of the most recent SMPTE Technology Committee meetings. And our two speakers today generally are the folks who lead those meetings and organize them. These are complementary to everybody because we want everybody to know just how hard our standards community works in developing standards and what progress they've made. We also record them and publish them on demand for on-demand viewing, and again, everybody is welcome to watch the on-demand videos if you want to go back and review something or if you couldn't make the live session. If you'd like to ask a question, we do encourage oral questions. Just type that in your box, the question box. Say, I have an oral question, and you will go to the top of the list. I'll unmute you so you can ask your question, and then remute you when the question is done. And that way you can speak directly to the presenters. If you don't have a microphone or you just prefer not to speak to our presenters, just type your question. I'll read it on your behalf, and I'll try to do the best job I can. We will provide a PDF of select slides used in the presentation today in exchange for your feedback as always. And shortly after this webcast, you should receive an email. And in that email, there'll be a link to our typical normal online feedback form. And that's where you will complete the form, submit it, you'll be automatically redirected for the PDF so you can download it. And then, of course, always, if you participate in social media, please tell your friends about it. Our Twitter handle is @SMPTEConnect, hashtag SMPTEWebcast, hashtag enabling global education. And our two very special, always special, wonderful speakers are Bruce Devlin. Bruce is the Standards Vice President for SMPTE, and my teammate, Thomas Bausa Mason. He is Director of Standards Development on staff at SMPTE. And with that, Bruce, I am turning the floor over to you as I go away.
Thank you, Joel. So welcome, everyone. This is the SMPTE Standards webcast, where we're going to be telling you what's happened in our most recent standards meetings. I'm the Standards Vice President. I wasn't physically at these meetings because I had an alternative thing that I needed to do, so I was stuck here in rain-soaked UK. But Thomas, you were there.
Yeah, we had a nice meeting. I guess you're going to talk about that in more detail in a moment. Our host took very good care of us, and so I think it was a success.
Excellent. Well, let's crack on. So, Thomas, why don't you do this one, as you were the man on the ground? Tell us about the wine that everybody seems to have and how wonderful Arista were to us.
Yeah, we have our quarterly standards committee meetings. So they happened usually in March, June, September, and then December every year. So this one in December 2019 was from the 9th to the 12th in Santa Clara, USA. And it was hosted by Arista Networks, a very great host. You see our host just in the center of the slide on the bottom in his nice Christmas vest, and it's Robert Welch from Arista. He did really an outstanding job to host us. Free lunches, free breakfasts, and tons of little gifts. And the highlight was illuminated pen. So that took it away.
I did wonder what everybody was holding just down there at the left. And please tell me that Robert chose that waistcoat all by himself and we didn't force him to wear it.
No, he did that voluntarily, so it was all his choosing. And yes, those are the lights. Unfortunately, that depends. Unfortunately, you can't see the lights, so we thought it was funny, but obviously the joke didn't come through.
Well, tell me a little bit about that photo on the top left, Thomas. What's that all about with the certificates?
Yeah, we are rewarding our TC chairs every year with a certificate for accomplishment of 1 year of TC chairmanship. Obviously, we're always looking for new chairs, and this is kind of like the pinnacle of a volunteer. How do you say? Engagement you can do at SMPTE, being a TC chair, running one of our 9 SMPTE technology committees, which usually meet during the standards committee meetings. We do have 10. One of the technology committees doesn't meet there. They only meet, I think, once a year during the SMPTE annual conference in LA. So that's how it got down to 9. We have 12 subgroups which are talking about their work and to advance it, and then present the results to the technology committees. What else is there to say? Yeah, I mean, we had a very nice social event with drinks and little canopies and a buffet, so that was very nice. Again, Arista, thank you for that. And if you're interested in reading more about what we're going to tell you in this presentation, there's an outcome report available on the SMPTE website. So if you go to SMPTE and then standards outcome reports, you can get a PDF version of this. And I think we also post the video of this webinar on that same page after we.
So the upcoming meetings after Arista, the next one that we're going to have is I've made a mistake in these. You only spot the mistakes in your slides when you actually see them on the screen. So that should say Mumbai, India, because of course SMPTE India is not in Santa Clara, so that was my mistake there. So the SMPTE India is the next set of meetings we're going to be having between the 2nd and the 5th of March. It will be in Mumbai. Thomas, is the events page on the website, is that coming up soon?
The registration is pending. We are still trying to iron out some social events we want to host together with a TC meeting. So we're looking into having a Mumbai sightseeing tour, or if everything works out, we could have a longer tour going up to Delhi and then Agra and then the Taj Mahal. And so that's a little bit in flux at the moment. We still have to do some final discussions, and once that's resolved, we're going to put the registration page up. The registration page will then ask you about the participation in the TC meetings, but also if you would like to participate in the Mumbai sightseeing or the Taj Mahal tour, which is unfortunately connected with a small cost. So that will all be made published, and at the same time we are looking for people to register there so we can get the information for visa letters. If you travel to India, you require a business visa to go to the TC meetings, and our host, the Indian SMPTE section, will supply us with invitation letters so we can go to the the closest consulate, Indian consulate or embassy to get a visa.
So I really recommend that if you've not been to a SMPTE meeting before and you've always wanted to go to India, I mean, they're really VIPing us. We're likely to have local government ministers coming. It's actually going to take place at the Whistling Woods Film School, which has been voted as one of the top 5 film schools on the planet by various Hollywood training camps. So it really is going to be not just a bunch of standards, but it's also going to be quite a special event. And I thoroughly recommend people coming along to that if you're interested in standards. Then after that, in June, we're going to be in Portland, hosted by Amazon. And then in September, we'll be at the EBU in Geneva, which we do every other year. Again, 2 wonderful hosts who will look after us. And the SMPTE India one is going to be one of those standards meetings which is going to really stand out, and it's going to be really quite special. So look for this at the SMPTE.org website under the events menu, and you'll see the registration details there. And feel free to get in touch with people at HQ if anything is confusing about the event, of course, not just in general. Oh, I don't know, Thomas.
Also, oh, sorry. I will also send out a email to the standards community to alert everybody when the SWGO registration site is up.
Excellent, thanks, Thomas. So just a quick reminder of the standard structure. I put some photos in here of the SMPTE staff. So that's you, Thomas. Do you want to explain who these lovely people are?
Yeah, those are my two staff. They work in my team, the standards pillar at SMPTE, and that is Carissa on the right, and then we have Mauricio on the left. So they support what standards is doing. They help me organize these great meetings and publish our standards and such things.
Excellent. And my predecessor, Alan Lamshed, is there, and of course that's me. So the structure of the standards is that I head up the standards pillar, and what we're trying to do is publish documents and resources that allow technical interoperability within the film and TV worlds. My right-hand man, I really should put this the other way around and put you on the right, shouldn't I? My left-hand man in this diagram is Thomas. Between us, we run a thing called the Standards Committee, which looks after all the processes of doing standards. And then the chairs of each of these technology committees are members of the Standards Committee, and this is how we basically run the organization and publish all of our standards. We have 4 TC chair vacancies coming up on the 1st of January, 2 of which I have managed to fill. If you're on this webinar, or if you're watching this on YouTube later on and you fancy being a TC chair, please get in touch with me before the 16th of January, when I'll be making my final appointments. If you've not chaired a TC committee in SMPTE, but you've got experience of standards in other organizations and you're active within SMPTE, please again let me know, because the way that we run the TCs is that I have 2 chairs, and we tend to change the chairs over in antiphase. So effectively you would be paired with a TC chair who's got at least 1 year's worth of experience. And what I'm trying to do is to bring some younger people in to be chairs, so not necessarily the most experienced domain experts, because the domain experts are more easy to find, but to bring in younger people who want to help drive the industry forwards and help develop their chairmanship skills. We run our meetings under Robert's Rules of Order, and we've got a large operations manual which tells you what the rules are for the standards organization, then a bunch of administrative guidelines which give you the dotting the I's and crossing the T's on those rules. And thanks to Thomas and his staff, those are now all online at SMPTE.org underneath the policies and bylaws area. So again, if you're listening to this and you quite fancy being a TC chair, please get in touch, because I've got a policy where I'm trying to get younger enthusiastic folk into the chair position to give them experience of running these sorts of meetings.
Yeah, and I should also mention that we are working on establishing some training for our TC chairs, so that we're not going to leave you alone. We're going to help you to run these meetings effectively.
Yes, there is a deep end and a shallow end, and we're trying to make the deep end friendlier. Well, yeah, absolutely. So part of what I'd intended to do this during this webinar is to tell you a little bit about the JTM Roadmap and what's next for the 2110 ecosystem. But due to a number of planets lining up, I'm afraid we're not ready to make the announcements yet. So I'm going to have to defer this until the March catch-up, which we'll probably do towards the end of the month of March. So there won't be any special deep dive or cross-industry information this time around, because the information I was hoping to present today, the ink isn't quite dry on the bits of paper. So we'll defer that until March 2020, which means, Joel, you're off the hook for having to run a questionnaire this time around as well. Oops, come on, advanced slides. There we go. So let's kick off with the new projects that have been introduced in this meeting cycle. The way that this is presented is the project title has been summarized here, a quick intro as to what it actually is here, and these are the various committees that you saw on the previous slides. So let's just run through these quickly. So we've got an existing standard called VC3, probably better known as DNxHD and DNxHR, and we're amending that standard to add support for alpha channels, and that reports to the 10E Essence Committee. Within the digital cinema community, 21DC, there's some current practice for doing certain sorts of digital cinema mastering that involves hybrid tone mapping algorithms, and that's being documented in a new RDD 52 that's going through 21DC. Within the 24TB community, which is mostly to do with ancillary services and logging and identifiers, we've got a couple of uses of a thing called OBID, Open Binding of Identifiers, and we've got an engineering guideline and a recommended practice, and those are currently being revised. So these two projects have kicked off this meeting cycle. In the Cinema Surround Systems 25CSS group, we've got a study on what's known as the B-chain characteristics and expectations. So essentially, this is how do you make the sound reproduction in the cinema match the sound reproduction that took place on the soundstage. And there's lots of fine detail involved in making all of that happening. And so a recommended practice is being drafted as a result of some work that had taken place in a study group here. Within 30MR, the Metadata and Registers Technology Committee, we have a number of defining documents that define how the registers are actually structured. We also have an administrative guideline which gives you the operational procedure for submitting new entries into the registers. And just because these things don't magically update themselves, they've got a little bit out of sync. So there's work going on to make certain that the operational procedures line up with the underlying definitions of those registers. And that's been kicked off this meeting cycle in 30MR. 31FS is effectively the MXF and DPX Technology Committee, and we've got a new mapping of putting JPEG XS into MXF, and the work that was taking place up here to define the alpha channel support in VC3, well, that's also being mapped into MXF, and that's taking place in the 31FS Technology Committee. As we get to the 31FS report, we'll also talk about a thing called the multi-channel audio labeling subdescriptor. Yeah, we really should get some marketing involved in some of these namings, but it does what it says on the tin. It's a subdescriptor that labels multi-channel audio. That document's been split in two, and one of the things that needs to be done is a controlled vocabulary needs to be created. So again, this is a bit of a departure from the normal ways of doing things, but we're trying to make it easier to implement and manage all of these standards and specifications. So that's, again, a new bit of work taking place in 31FS. In our Networks and Facilities Technology Committee, which is where all the STI and SMPTE 2110 work takes place, we're looking at how SMPTE 2110 meshes with ATSC, DVB, Arrive, etc. So there are certain properties that we need to get right and transfer some of those properties across these boundaries so that we get things like channel changing happening in reasonable time within these distribution systems. So a new study group's just being created. We haven't had any meetings yet, but that's just being kicked off now. That's in 32NF.
Also, Bruce, sorry, I just wanted, because this I think is a good example how SMPTE sits upstream from these distribution standards, and we're working together with these organizations to make sure to harmonize our standards with what's needed downstream in distribution. So just as a point that we don't work in isolation, this is a good example where we're trying to work together.
Absolutely, yes, I forgot to say that. Thank you, Thomas. Let's finish off these two. So we're doing the ancillary data in 2110. That's being revised, part of the 1 year and 5 year revisions work. Within the IMF group, 35PM packaging, we are looking at the output profile list and how we manipulate IMF to make AS11 broadcast delivery files. And finally, the last of the new projects this cycle is IMF Application 4, which is a cinema mezzanine in IMF. What we're looking at is how do we include the digital cinema distribution master standard definition, standard dynamic range, not high dynamic range. How do we include that work inside IMF so it can be packaged and archived within IMF? So those are the new projects that we've kicked off this time round. So just pause there to see if there's any questions, Joel, on the new projects.
We do have two questions, actually. One is from our friend Jim. Jim asks, will the RP on BChain address use of immersive audio formats?
I believe that is absolutely in scope. I think the precise scope of that study is still being worked on. The project scope is on the website at the moment, and they're just kicking off that work now as a result of the study group studies. But yes, I believe immersive audio does fall within the remit of that BChain work.
Thank you very much. And then another friend of SMPTE, Martin, he says, new timecode project TLS?
Oh, that's still ongoing. There's been no new projects started in that work. I will come to that in the 32NF report, but essentially that work was revamped in the last meeting cycle 3 months ago, and I'll give you a progress report to that when we get to 32NF. This list is just the things that have been spawned since the September meetings that we had in Erlangen.
Much appreciated. And that is the final question for this section.
Excellent. In that case, we will leap straight into the 10E TC report. So 10E is the Essence Technology Committee. The scope of that committee is on the left, and basically it does things like compression, high dynamic range, reference displays, environments, audio. So basically, before you package stuff up, this is the committee that looks after it. Oops, there we go. So we'll kick off with a quick review of the compression projects. So in kind of the order that they're being touched, the first one is SMPTE 2117, which is called VC6. It goes by a trade name of Perseus. That had an FCD ballot. It passed that FCD ballot, so it reached numerical consensus, and it had 107 comments. In fact, I've just come off the call where we've been processing those, and actually 2 of those were duplicates. So actually there's only 105 comments. And the team is working their way through those, and we expect resolution to be complete early February, late January, something like that. There's also a reference Python decoder that's waiting in the wings, and the goal is to introduce that for the follow-on work to do with compliance once that initial bitstream standard gets completed. The next one is 2073, also known as VC5 or the Cineform codec. The metadata part of that, 2073 part 7, has finally passed its FCD ballot. There are a number of changes in 2073 part 7 that required an update to the conformance part of the document, which is 2073 part 2. And that also includes a reference decoder, which has been uploaded to the SMPTE GitHub account. And if you're a SMPTE Standards member and you want to play with the Cineform decoder, you can download that code, you can build it, and you can play with it. So this group, 2073 Part 2, is currently doing an update to all of that work to incorporate some of the changes that took place in 2073 Part 7. 2042 Part 2, VC2, also known as DIRAC. Again, the conformance suite is being updated to include the way that high dynamic range and wide color gamut. I still haven't changed that spelling mistake. That should be a C and not a B. I do apologize. It's got a bitstream validator, and it's also got some good path analysis of the code coverage. And when that finally gets finished in about June 2020, I'm hoping to invite the team to present this work on the code coverage of the wavelet arithmetic to this group, because it's really interesting, the mathematical techniques and the tree techniques that they've used to show how well the conformance code actually fits the underlying standard. So really interesting bit of work, which I hope to present here sometime after June. RDD 51, which was a nice quick RDD. This was looking at lossless encoding of ARRI raw. It was an RDD, so it's a slightly shorter process. It went through its ballot, passed its ballot, and it's now awaiting some comment responses. So all the comments, I believe, have been addressed, and we're looking at those responses. As I mentioned earlier on, there's a new project that's entered the fold. So ST 2019 Part 1 is being revised. It's a revision to add alpha channels. A DG has been formed, and meetings should start in January. Next group of projects within 10E. The 2080 reference display work. Not much has taken place over the last quarter, so we're pretty much still where we were 3 months ago. The full measurement and calibration document has had a bunch of FCD comments, 73 of them. Many of them have been addressed, but there's not been much progress in the last quarter. And this work on the calibration and measurement has been paused until Part 4 is complete. 2093 is the Television Lighting Consistency Index. In other words, if you've got mixed lighting, such as LEDs, tungsten, fluorescence, how consistent is that lighting and how do the cameras pick it all up? So all of that work underwent FCD ballot. Most of the comments have been resolved. There's one remaining comment, and hopefully we'll get all of that done and dusted and get that finishing its publication in the next quarter or so. Next one is dynamic metadata for color volume transformation. So you'll be aware that there are 4 different apps that were standardized. This one is app 4. App 4 is documented in ST 2094 Part 40. The first of the FCD ballots didn't reach numerical consensus, and it had to go back around the loop again. It's taken about a year to do all of that work, but I'm really pleased to report that as a result of really hard work by the commenters and the comment resolvers, the second FCD ballot started just a few days ago, and hopefully when that gets completed in mid-January, hopefully we'll hit numerical consensus this time around and this document can complete its transit. This is one of those documents that does impact other standards from CTA and ATSC and others, and we've been holding off a liaison communication until we got to this point of the FCD ballot. So I'm happy to report that as Standards Vice President, I finished all the work on that liaison today, and I hope to send that out to the various people who have requested it, hopefully tonight, because it's now nighttime in the UK. If not, it'll be first thing tomorrow, Friday in the UK. Got a new piece of work called the Academy Spectral Similarity Index. So if you like, this is the cinema equivalent of the Television Lighting Consistency Index. The documents received a number of really helpful comments during its pre-FCD review. Those have all been addressed. It's now a committee draft, and it's now awaiting its FCD ballot, and hopefully that'll get kicked off relatively soon. The Academy Color Encoding System is SMPTE ST 2065. It's undergoing its 1-year revision. A number of tweaks are needing to take place, and so the Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3 documents are all currently being drafted to get those up to spec as a result of their 1 year in the field. There's an RP that's been created for measurement methods of the resolution characteristics of camera systems. So if you like, this is defining things like MTF and other of the standard methods used to measure camera characteristics. There's a really good ARRIVE document from Japan. An English translation of that document has been received, and as a result, this RP group has now about to start their first meeting, or might just have had their first meeting, and they're starting drafting on this new standard. That completes the report for Tenny. Thomas, did I miss anything out there?
No, you covered it all, I believe.
Excellent. It is one of my special interests, TC, so I'm able to speak and talk at the same time, speak and think at the same time. Joel, do we have any questions on Tenny?
Well, our guest Jim has more of a comment, I think. He says, hello. I heard from colleagues that Mr. Peter Dare from Sony will no longer attend these meetings as he's now retired. If true, it would be a great loss to all of us.
So I wish to report that although Peter Dare doesn't travel as much as he did when he retired, he is stuck in the glorious sunshine, in fact, glorious, very, very hot sunshine of Australia at the moment, but he is still contributing. My inbox is, I wouldn't say awash with comments from Peter Dare, but Peter is still very much contributing to the work of SMPTE, and he keeps us honest, and I very much value Peter's contributions. So, so Jim, if you want to help me field Peter's emails, I'm more than happy for some help. But if that doesn't keep Jim quiet, nothing will.
And that is all we have for now.
Excellent. So moving on, just to mention the 20F Technology Committee. 20F tends to meet once a year at the SMPTE annual technical conference. They did meet, nothing significant to report, or at least I haven't been given a report to give you. And if I do receive a report, then I will update it at the next webinar. Next one is 21DC, Digital Cinema. So this TC looks after all things digital cinema. If you've heard the phrase DCP or DCDM, this is where it gets discussed, and specifically SMPTE 428 and 429 are the very broad document suites that cover a lot of the work inside this technology committee. So the work that's been done in the most recent cycle, we've got SMPTE 429 Part 2, which is the constraints for DCPs. A complicated update here because effectively there were two orthogonal pieces of work that took place that resulted in a revision to this, which is to do with subtitling, and an amendment that was to do with frame rates. They went through the committees at different speeds and ended up pretty much at the same place at the same time, which was curious. As a result, we need to inspect how the amendment, which was done against the original 429 Part 2, and how that can be applied against the revision. Now, a little bit of procedural stuff here, just for your information. If the Technology Committee says that the amendment is essentially an editorial update of the revision, then it can be done by headquarters. But if it requires a domain expert to make a judgment on any of the edits that are required by rolling up the amendment, then it needs to be done by a domain expert. And that could be something as trivial as if there's a normative reference where the dates are different, then somebody who's a domain expert needs to check that the update of the normative reference wouldn't cause anything to break. And that might be as simple as referencing an external standard to do with, for example, subtitles. If that reference has changed because of something that's happened here, that might be toxic to an alternative amendment. So it's a bit subtle, and it might seem like just a delaying tactic, as somebody said to me the other day, but it really isn't. We don't want to introduce breaks into our documents by just pretending that a normative reference update is editorial when actually it might have serious impacts to the document. Do you want to say anything about this, Thomas? After all, the HQ operations are your domain.
Yeah, I can only support that point. We're not necessarily the domain expert on these standards projects. What we are focusing on is, final review of the standards, and then doing everything we can in terms of editorial changes. But as soon as it comes to technical issues, we could find an answer, but we really should leave it up to the TC experts to comment on those.
And this, particularly in the normative reference issue, it's something that we do have to be careful about. And I'm an MXF expert, and we do have issues when underlying normative references do change, and that we do actually have to update some of our documents as a result of those underlying normative reference changes. So it is something that we do have to be careful of, and huge thanks to Thomas and the team who pick these things up and go, is this really right? It really isn't a delaying tactic. It really is because these become international standards and we want them to be right all the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one thing I wanted to say too is especially 21DC and the digital cinema standards, We have the ability to take these standards and send them to organizations like, for example, the ISO, because we are an ANSI accredited standards organization. So we have a gateway into the International Standards Organization, ISO. For that reason, we obviously have to make sure that everything is bulletproof and that our documents really make sense. Maybe as a side note here, we're trying to now make our documents also look like ISO standards. So at the end, if we do these submissions to ISO, that we don't have to do much editorial work to fit it to the ISO look.
Excellent. All part of trying to make SMPTE a good and robust standards organization. So cracking on with the long list. So another update is in the field, issues have been identified where vertical Japanese strings inside horizontally rendered strings don't always render correctly. So this group is looking at that to try and figure out where the issues lie. In SMPTE 429 Part 4, there is one comment about a normative reference to SMPTE 377 Part 1 2004, which is an old normative reference. That's been set aside because a lot of the in fact, all of the DCP references point to the old version of 377 and not the newer versions of 377 because there is a normative reference incompatibility between the old and the new 377s. That may be addressed in the future. We need to get all the TC people together to see if we can update that and do a risk analysis to figure out what's going on there. There's also an immersive audio group that's just published the track file specification, the DCP operational constraints, the key delivery messages, the screen management, media block communications protocol. There's a few FCD ballot comments to be addressed on that. This RP may not be needed because ST 2098 Part 2, the bitstream spec when it was published, is now robust enough, so that is possibly not going to be needed. It might actually be rolled up into another document. And the digital sync signal and auxiliary data transfer protocol has quite an active discussion going on in GitHub, where a lot of these document issues are discussed in minute detail and very effectively discussed as well. All credit to the technology committee doing this work and doing it on GitHub. It seems to be working really well. We've also got a new project that's come in, as I mentioned in the new projects. This is the one that's looking at real-world mastering constraints and bringing them in an RDD. And just a quick word about the way that this DC is using GitHub. For each one of these documents that's undergoing revision, an issue tracker has been created within GitHub, and this gives a forum for people raising issues, discussing those issues and figuring out whether or not they actually need to be fixed and whether or not the issues can be solved in these documents or whether another document needs to be updated to fix the issue correctly. All the issues are labeled with whether they're blockers, critical, editorial, or whatever. And actually, it seems to be a very good way of promoting offline discussion between experts who are in different time zones and within the same time zone to getting a more effective document maintenance procedure. Seems to be working well. It started in the IMF group, it's been rolled out to 21 DC, and I'm hoping to roll it out to other TCs as we gain experience in the use of this mechanism. Anything you want to add, Thomas?
No, I think that covers us all. I think maybe point out a little bit more that we're trying to do our document development on GitHub as well. The private GitHub account SMPTE has, you mentioned it before. So if you are an SC member, you can get access to these folders on GitHub as well and look at some of these documents. There's an effort in SMPTE to at least start with our administrative documents to make them HTML files so that we can put them on the SMPTE website and create interlinking, which makes these documents much easier to use. So, and with the added side effect that if you're on Google and you're searching for something, SMPTE has a higher chance to coming up.
Excellent, thank you, Thomas. And with some trepidation, I ask Joel, has Jim asked another question?
Jim has not asked another question. In fact, our queue is empty for the time being.
I must confess a little disappointment. I was expecting a curveball from Jim there, but I'm setting myself up for failure for the next TC report because I'm sure he'll find something. So the next one is 24TB, which is mostly looking at ancillary services, but also includes things like OBID, the Open Binding of IDs, and it is chaired by Bill Miller. So the Open Binding IDs, which is basically how do you carry IDs and add IDs such that you can get them all the way from the originator all the way through to the TV screen so that you can do things like audience measurement. Those are undergoing one-year revisions. The one-year revisions are awaiting their FCD ballot. The one-year reviews from parts 10, 11, 12, and 21 are in ST audit. And a revision on how to use active format description and bar data in UHD is still in drafting because there is some debate about whether or not it is actually relevant or not. And that concludes 24DB. Don't think there's going to be any questions?
No questions at this time.
Then we'll plow on to 25CSS, the Cinema Sound Systems TB, which is terrible if you have a Sibyllitic Lisp, chaired by Brian Long and Bill Redman. And this covers things like 2098 immersive audio bitstream and B-chain characteristics. So the immersive sound model, which is ST2098 part 2, which is the bitstream, was published about 6 months ago now, and that unblocked a whole bunch of work. The immersive audio renderer expectations and the immersive audio renderer interoperability testing, those were merged in the last 3-month cycle to create one single document, and that single document is now awaiting its FCD ballot. So this particular project has been closed, and that will vanish, and so now we will just have EG2098 part 3. As a result of the study group that was looking at the B-chain characteristics and expectations, the report of that group was presented in the Erlangen meeting cycle 3 months ago, and members of 25CSS can read that report, which is internal just to this TC. If you want to become a member of this TC and you're already a standards participant, then all you have to do is on our OLC, go to this TC, click on join, and then look in the documents, and you should find the study group report. As a result of that, the TC created a drafting group to prepare a recommended practice to look at things like the playback of modern digital full dynamic range movie soundtracks. They haven't had a meeting yet. That's hoping to start in the January timeframe. And if you're interested in this subject, I thoroughly recommend joining and taking part because it's going to be interesting. Any questions on 25CSS?
We have none.
Oof, I feel like I've dodged a questionable bullet just then. So let's leap into 30MR, which is the Metadata and Registers Technology Committee. Essentially, this is the TC that is responsible for the SMPTE.org data. So everything you find on this website is approved by 30MR, and it's HQ that does the mechanics of publishing and maintaining the site. So within this TC, we have some updates that have been going on for a while. So SMPTE 330, UMID, the Universal Media ID, the magic number that appears on the inside of every single MXF file ever created. And as far as I'm aware, there has never been a UMID clash apart from 6 that I've managed to detect in the industry. And those were clashes because somebody hand edited some files rather than following the rules. Naughty people. So this group is looking at applications of UMID, which hasn't progressed this quarter. The UMID resolution protocol, which is awaiting on that the SMPTE 330 revision. And the SMPTE 330 revision itself, which is the revision of the underlying UMID, needed a normative reference for some geospatial positioning standards. Originally, the standard that we referenced was a military standard, but it turns out that's not globally accessible. There are some countries in the world which for some reason are not able to access American military standards. Wonder why that is. So the hard workers in this group discovered that a commercial airline international standard actually provided a good alternative to it. It took a little while to validate that this was a valid normative reference by the ANSI rules that we have to follow. But by the time we'd done that work, we approved the use of ICAO as a normative reference, and we've taken the handbrake off, and work can continue on SMPTE 330, and this can unblock the remainder of the work that needs to be done within this particular project. Another blocker was a thing called ST 2088. This is a brand new register. It's an essence element key register. In other words, the magic numbers you find inside MXF files that refer to specific essence types, we've got a new register for those. We've been aggregating the register entries in a spreadsheet until such time as the register structure has been standardized. That's finally been published, and so as a result, we can unblock a bunch of work, and that spreadsheet will be used to populate the essence element register, and that will go into the Sriracha revision of all of the registers. And if you want to know why all the registers are named after hot sauces, you'll probably have to ask Phil Tudor at the BBC, because I don't remember. But what I do know is each time we have a new revision, it gives me a brand new shopping experience in my local supermarket. And my goodness, some of these things are hot. As I mentioned in the new projects section, the defining documents that define how the elements register works, how the groups register works, how the labels register works, and how the types register works, those are undergoing their 5-year revisions. And so new projects have been created to revise these documents and to normalize them against our operational procedures document AG18, which is available on the SMPTE website. There's a brand new project that kicked off 3 months ago to do with using UIDs in file names. There's good reasons why you'd like to do this, but without an operational practice, chaos will ensue. This is particularly important for organizations that are archiving these sorts of files. And one of the proponents of this study group is the Library of Congress. And so this looks to be an interesting project to try and marry some deep tech along with some operational practice to try and keep all the operators on the planet sane. The registers themselves, which you'll find the working development areas here. If you're a SMPTE member, SMPTE standards member, you can find the passwords to get into the development pages, so you can figure out what's going on down at the very low level to generate these different releases of the registers. So Tabasco is currently in its 6-month publishing cycle, and Sriracha is collecting the new essence elements. And that spreadsheet from 2088 is going to go into that one. So it's reasonably automated, and it allows us to get through a bunch of register entries and allows us to cross-check all of those register entries, and makes headquarters life somewhat simpler, because headquarters are not the people who need to validate the technical correctness of the entry, but headquarters do have to look after the publishing of registers on the SMPTE website. Do you want to add anything, Thomas?
No, I've only maybe that if you have your own universal labels and you want them registered in the SMPTE registry, you can purchase your own metadata node, class 14 node we call it, and with that you can have your private metadata. If you purchase a class 13 node, you actually get public metadata, so you can add your URLs to the SMPTE register for a global view.
And there's about 20 organizations, I think, that have purchased their own nodes within the registers. And I think they fall into 2 classes, and correct me if I'm wrong, that one class of node purchaser are people like major broadcasters who are inserting their own MXF metadata into their MXF ecosystems, and others are equipment vendors who want to put metadata generated by their own equipment and software into the MXF ecosystem. And as Thomas says, you can have your own node if that's important to you and you want to tabulate all of the data that you're going to effectively make public by putting them into MXF files that circulate the MXF waters of the world, this is one way to do it.
Yeah, so we have quite a few. We have the BBC, RIPE, ATSC, PBS, so there are quite a few organizations which in here, and actually we are, as soon as I get to it, we are probably up to 21 now, because there's somebody who just bought a note, and I just have to get them into the register. Excellent,
sounds like Christmas. Any questions, Joel?
There are no questions at this point, but I'd like to remind our guests that you can ask questions at any time. We prefer oral questions, if you would. And I have a suggestion. If you think that someone else might have a question, even if you know the answer, please ask that question.
Thank you very much, Joel. Let's move on to 31FS, File Formats and Systems, chaired by Fred Walls and the award-winning Paul Gardner. And I say award-winning because Paul was awarded the Excellence in Standards Award at the SMPTE Annual Technical Conference in October, and I had the great pleasure of handing to one of my own mentors a plaque to reward him for the many, many years of service he's given SMPTE. Paul has taught me an awful lot of things, and I'm very grateful to him for all of his tutelage. So 31FS is predominantly MXF and MXF related issues. The first document is the constrained revision of MXF itself, 377-1, version 2019. Now this revision is the last revision of MXF that refers to the old style registers that were maintained using Excel spreadsheets. And what we wanted to do here was to effectively pour concrete onto a version of MXF to say, right, we're kind of drawing a line now. This is the version of the document that refers to all the old spreadsheets in the old style. Since then, we've created these new registers that are all online and all XML. And the next big revision of MXF is likely to take 2 or 3 years and will almost certainly involve rewriting and chopping up the document into a different structure so that we can make it more modular, more maintainable, and more testable. And it's one of my personal goals as Mr. MXF and the SVP, and because it's one of SMPTE's tentpole standards, to try and make that work as backwards compatible as is possible, and to try and leave MXF in a state at the end of this big revision where actually things like digital cinema, things like broadcast AS11, things like IMF, things like DCDMs, all the various tabulated uses of MXF actually have a reference model against which you can test them. So it's going to be a big project. And if you're interested in that, if MXF is key to your business, whether as a user or an equipment vendor, I really, really urge you to get in touch. Please contribute, especially in the early days when we're deciding how to carve up MXF. That work's likely to start early next year, so please get in touch. This is going to be a big thing. SMPTE 377 Part 4 is the multi-channel audio labeling framework. In other words, if I've got audio tracks in MXF, what language are they in? This work was split into 2, one to do with the framework about how you put the labels into MXF to say, hey, this is stereo, and it's English stereo, and it's English stereo with an American accent. So that label framework is in this document, and that's awaiting FCD ballot. And the actual vocabulary values themselves has been split off into a separate document. And that work is just starting now because the project's just been approved. And the reason for doing that is it's very likely that that vocabulary, which contains things like audio kind, in other words, saying, hey, this is STEM material, this is test material, this is primary soundtrack. So all of those audio kinds are likely to grow over time as MXF and IMF start to be used for more applications. And so to make the maintenance lower effort and make it easier to keep these standards in line, we split this out into a brand new audio vocabulary. And once that document's stabilized, it is very likely that Thomas and I will be having discussions about how to make this easily downloadable on the Registers website. But that's a bit of speculation for the future from the SVP there. SMPTE 380 and SMPTE RP 2057, both of these have kind of paused because I am the editor for these documents, and I'm also the editor for this one, and in getting that one out and doing some of the other work, these have paused because I've run out of bandwidth, so not much has happened in the last 3 months. 381-5, however, this is mapping HEVC or H.265 into the MXF generic container. Been quite an active little group there. They've had some really good meetings and really good discussions. Really enjoyed the discussions there. Many thanks to especially the guys from Sony and Panasonic for really stimulating the discussions there. This has new register values. The UL submissions have been put into 30MR, and those UL submissions, I believe, in the last couple of days have been elevated to mature status. So again, unblocking the progress of this document, and this can carry on its merry way through FCD ballots. So thank you very much, 30MR folks, and thank you the guys in this committee. IDD 50, which is packing DNX uncompressed into MXF. That was a very quick document. It went from initiation to publishing in under 6 months. So thanks to the team for getting that one through nice and quickly. ST422 was revised to map J2K-HT, the high throughput variant of J2K, which is ISO IEC 15444, part 15. That is now in the publication queue. Again, nice zippy little update to our ST422. Its counterpart, effectively, the mapping of JPEG XS into MXF, that's just started drafting now. This is a brand new project that's kicked off. Hopefully this group will see that there's a way to do this in ST422. If that doesn't fit, then they'll end up with a brand new standard. So I'll look with interest to see how that group does their mappings. Also, because ACES is being revised, that revision is also knocking on to the MXF mappings. We're also trying to format these documents for easy submission to ISO. So this work has been, that drafting work's been carrying on for about 3 months now. And there's a proposed new project to do with this work, and it's all chugging along quite nicely. There's another couple of projects that are non-MXFE. One is to do with the updates for DPX, which is ST268. That work has now been published, and so a reference model is being created for the high dynamic range updates for DPX v2. So a C++ implementation with reference files and coverage tracking spreadsheet, that's all being created now, and that work is progressing. And the other big project within this committee is AXF, the archive exchange format. As a result of doing the external uses of XML schema, they discovered that there was a requirement for a new data type within the part 1 structures and semantics called conditional any. And the introduction of that data type has caused a revision of part 1, and that is currently holding up the progress in part 2. But the good thing is they found it, they fixed it, and we're moving on. Anything you want to add, Thomas?
Yeah, maybe because it's so much fun to talk about ISO. AXF is another standard which was made available in ISO through what is called the public, publicly available specification. So that's a process. SMPTE can go down as a liaison A member to submit documents to ISO as well. In regards to the formatting of the SMPTE standards in ISO style, we created and discussed for a while a Word template which will help our document editors to give them a starting point to develop these ISO compliant documents. So that will start in the new year for all new projects. They're going to start with the ISO template in SMPTE, and then we, at the end, hopefully have ISO compliant documents.
Outstanding. That's going to be very exciting. Any questions, Joel, or shall I press on?
We have 2 of them, actually.
Yay!
The first one is from Anthony, and Anthony wants to know if the audio vocabulary aligns with AES 70.
So these are slightly different audio vocabularies in that this particular vocabulary that they started on was specifically for a thing called the content kind vocabulary. And the content kind vocabulary is what is this thing being used for? I believe that there are 3 members of the group who are also in the AES group, and I believe that that harmonization of the content kinds defined in AES has taken place. And I know that once we've got this initial document out, that one of the things we want to do is to promote much closer alignment with AES. And one of the ways we're going to do that is we're trying to look at whether or not we can have almost an invisible document sharing policy with AES. And we're trying to figure out how we do that so that if any gap ever appears between us and the AES, then it vanishes almost as quickly as it appears. So short answer is, I don't think that there's any drift because it's the same people doing the same work. And I know that as we go into the future, we're trying to put in place working practices to ensure that there is absolutely no divergence between SMPTE and the AES. Good question, thank you.
And thank you. We do have one more question from our other guest named Jim. Jim says, RDD 50. Do you mean DNX compressed? If uncompressed, is this to deal with metadata along with uncompressed essence?
So DNX uncompressed is a mechanism that was introduced by the DNX proponents to allow improved editing of raw type files. I'm trying not to use any proprietary words here. I'm trying to use the standards words. It was introduced as an RDD because it is subject to change, as far as I understand the way that the document works. And that's because raw formats going into it change quite a lot. So I think that's why it was done as an RDD. Just read out the second part of the question again, because I think my brain has just slipped a bit.
Yes. If uncompressed, is this to deal with metadata along with uncompressed essence?
It does deal with metadata in uncompressed essence because I think it extends the underlying 377 mechanisms. I haven't read the document for about 4 months, so my brain has now dissolved into nothingness and can't remember exactly what the differences are, but it is in the IEEE store, so anyone who's got a subscription to this SMPTE standards can go and get the document.
Thank you. That is our final question for this segment.
Thank you. So moving on to 32NF. 32NF is Networks and Facilities, chaired by the extremely fast-running Thomas Kernan and the slightly slower-running Lee Whitcomb. So 32NF covers things like SDI, IP, PDP, data on AES networks, SMPTE 2022, 2110, 337, all those sorts of things, which are basically moving stuff around on cables. So we'll kick off with the EG 2111 suite, which is basically a bunch of EGs presented as large posters. Those require an awful lot of drafting and checking. It really is a labor of love to get these things out, and I have a huge respect to the drafting committees because it's really hard work, especially when you can't actually print out your documents on an A4 or a letter piece of paper because the fonts come out in 0.1 font. I think the last time we printed one of these on A4, it took 21 pieces of paper. So it's kind of tricky to do these things, and so the committee said, is it better to split these things into 4 documents? And the answer is actually no, not really, because although that helps the editors, it doesn't make as good a wall chart. And so they're going on and proceeding and trying to get these things out. Again, huge respect to the folks doing this work. It's really tricky stuff. There's been a revision to SMPTE 2038, which had 9 FCD ballot comments. Those are in resolution and have been in resolutions some time, hoping to get those sorted within the next few months. The new project that we talked about right at the very beginning was about the delivery ecosystem and how the standards organizations play nicely together and what we have to do within SMPTE to make certain the things that we do upstream make for a good consumer experience downstream. In the SMPTE 2110 world, a lot of these documents are undergoing their 1-year revision, and a lot of drafting is going on. I suppose the big hitter one is part 10, which is the system timing and definitions. They've been looking at things like asynchronous operations, reconstruction delays, improvements to the RTP timestamp definitions. Recently, maybe a small addition related to clock accuracy has been found, but I think pretty much all of these big topics are reaching fruition now. Certainly the amount of chatter on the forums appears to be getting to the point where it looks like consensus is arriving, and this 1-year revision, which has taken a couple of years, will hopefully boil down to a document which we can put into the process. And for people who are unfamiliar with our process, we will go through it again sometime in 2020. The most difficult and slow bit of the process is not the process itself, it's getting really smart people to agree on really difficult things. If anybody's been watching politicians recently in any of the English-speaking countries, you'll know that getting smart people to agree on difficult things is a challenge. Moving on, so part 20, which is the video document, waiting a pre-CD ballot review. Part 21, which is the traffic shaping. There's still drafting ongoing based on the testing that has been done in the interops to make certain that reality agrees with what's in the document. Part 23 is currently reaching ST audit, so that should hit the stores hopefully just after Christmas time. Part 24, which is standard definition video, that's currently in drafting, and defining what standard definition video is appropriate needs to be done, and certainly we're getting good help from all the user communities here who basically are putting in their requirements to make certain that we're doing just enough of the work here to make certain it's useful. 1-year review for part 30, it was decided no action was needed, but the 1-year review for ancillary data, it was decided that some drafting and updates needs to take place, and so a new project has been formed to get ancillary data in 2110 updated. That's kind of taking oxygen out the room that slowed down FMX, the fast metadata exchange. And if you remember, this project says, hang on, why are we, if 2110 is putting video in a video grain, an audio in an audio grain, and metadata in a metadata grain, why are we wrapping the metadata up in ancillary data wrappers other than for legacy reasons? And so for certain metadata, unwrapping it from the ANC wrapper and putting it natively into 2110 seems like a really smart thing to do. And once these revisions are complete, hopefully work on FMX will continue again, and we'll start to see the first of the SMPTE 2110 native metadata parcels, grains, whatever the right word is, being shoved over a 2110 pipe. 2022 part 3 is just about to be published. That's transport streams on an IP network. A potential EG on migrating black burst timing to 2110 and PTP has been awaiting proposals for a long time. There's so much work going on elsewhere that all the experts really are busy. So hopefully we'll get around to that relatively soon. And a thing called the Protocol Implementation and Conformance Statement, or the PICS statement, which is a bit tautological. Again, that's waiting resources because there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on within the 2110 community. Within time labeling and synchronization, we've got the revisions went through FCD ballots. Of the 56 FCD comments on part 1, there's a couple of comments remaining. On the 29 FCD comments on part 2, there's just 1 comment remaining. There's a whole bunch of interoperability testing events that we do. The one from February, there's still some consideration going on the results of power on testing, managing messaging storms, GM failover, etc. And the reason why it's tricky to publish these things is all the results have to be anonymized because there are some antitrust issues that we have to make certain are covered. SMPTE absolutely cannot publish anything that shows any kind of product comparison. That's against our governance and our bylaws. And so we have to be very, very careful in the publishing of these results to make certain that we don't break any of those rules. More tests will take place in May 2020, and a massive thanks to all the folks at the EBU, VSF and AMWA who help us with all of these tests. And without good inter-organization communications and coordination, these things just couldn't take place. And I'm wonderfully indebted to the help of everyone involved in these things. New activity from 3 months ago, the PTP device monitoring capabilities. There's an initial parameter list being created, and the drafting group is cross-checking with security project and cross-checking with PTP v2.1 to make certain that all the monitoring capabilities required in those domains are being done. And the goal is to build on a thing called Yang, which is a protocol definition language designed by the IETF. Yang was used to build a data model testing protocol for NTP, Network Time Protocol, if I remember, no, PTP, if I remember correctly. And that is described in RFC 8587. So it's using this language to define the testing of PTP. And the goal really is to have some media-centric variants on that defined in this PTP device monitoring and capabilities. So again, working with other standards bodies to minimize the drift between what we're doing and what the other standards bodies are doing. I promised to mention the time labeling system, TLX. This is ST2120. Earlier this year, we had to find a new chair for the group, and I'm happy to report that Bill Redman has taken up being the chair of TLX. As a result of that, the chair's been reinvigorated, the group's been reinvigorated, there's more discussions going on, the requirements for the group have been reassessed and redrafted again, and I'm seeing a lot of active chatter and some good collaboration taking place on OLC. So I'm encouraged that this has found some new momentum, and I'm hoping to get documents into some sort of ballot in the middle of next year. But that's my hope and not a report back from the TLX folks. I'm putting words in their mouth. So this is Bruce's hope that we'll get somewhere and have some sort of ballot in 2020. Putting data into AS3, the ST337 family. There's a revised working draft of putting MPEG-H streams into 337 and putting the audio definition model over AS3 that's currently in ST audit. And again, there's close liaisons going on with the AES here, and we've done other liaisons with other groups about how all of this works. The most recent one being with the IEC TC 100 SA20, I think it was, just remember which liaison group it was. That concludes the 32NF report. Thomas, I missed one of the most important groups out there. Do you know anything about the security TC and the report, Thomas?
Yeah, I kind of expected that you're going to put me on the spot here. Yes.
I'd be disappointed if I didn't.
I'm the chair of the study group on security in SMPTE 2059 PTP. So we this is an effort which is ongoing for a year now. We pushed out one report which was more informal to give people an understanding what the study group is doing, and requesting a participation call for actions to join the group and look at security for these networks. It was really coming out of a multi-organizational discussion about security and which organization could address which part of security. Previously, the security aspect in standards like ST2110 and ST2022 and ST2059, which are all dealing with IP, were kind of left to the side because most applications were walled garden applications, but that's not longer true. In the future, that might change dramatically. So the low-hanging fruit really was to look at PTP and what security threats you have to an PTP infrastructure. So the next report, which will hopefully come out fairly soon, is looking at a list of PTP threats, describing them. We put together a PTP infrastructure diagram, which we use as a kind of an example, and then we try to map the threats into that diagram in a follow-up report, and then also maybe look at mediation and in a follow-up report and map that into this as well. We have a glossary in there. We have a table which we borrowed from IETF and extended for our use to describe the severeness and the impact of PTP threats. And then we have a contribution from a broadcaster who shared their PTP infrastructure diagram with us and with some description of where they would see security issues arising and where you could do something about security.
Excellent.
Yeah,
and
so hopefully before NAB we have this report.
Well, we can probably give the listeners just a little quick preview that we have probably secured the help of some PTP and network time helpers from the Network Time Foundation, because you and I, Thomas, had a really good conversation with them less than 48 hours ago, and it seems that there's some really good opportunities for collaboration between media-specific security concerns and the more general PTP and NTP security concerns in the new versions of the IEEE standards.
Yeah, it's really about lessons learned in security for NTP, what the NTF, the Network Time Foundation, is doing. And if we talk about the NTF, then we should also talk about IEEE, because we had communication with them as well.
Oh, yes.
IEEE is revising their IEEE 1588 PTP standard, so it's gonna probably come out fairly soon. So we wanted to learn what they did in terms of security. So that goes in just to say IEEE has a broader application than SMPTE. While they're looking at public and private networks, our focus is more on private networks for media organizations. And then we also reached out informally to IETF to make sure that we are not missing parts. So there's some communication going on as well. So again, we're trying not to work in isolation. We're trying to really look at the broad industry and what's happening out there in other organizations. But we also look internally and for security and partner with, for example, SMPTE efforts like the PTP device monitoring and how security could fit into that. So there's a lot of discussion going on, lots of moving parts.
And you'll see that there's going to be a lot more security work coming from SMPTE over the coming years. And particularly for the wonderful people who've joined this webinar, it's kind of an open question from me and Thomas, is that if you want to find out more about security in networks and in media networks specifically, this particular series of webinars is an opportunity for us to invite guests in to give their views. So for example, we've talked to the Network Time Foundation. One of the things we chatted to them about was giving them a platform to talk about the broader issues of network time. And one of my thoughts was maybe we invite them as a guest in one of the quarterly webinars sometime in 2020 for them to come along and tell us a little bit more about the wider security aspects. So if you're willing to give us some feedback, oh wonderful listeners, either through the chat or by bugging Joel, because he will listen to you, whereas Bruce won't get your email for a little while. I'm sorry about that. So bug Joel, and if you want us to invite some guests like that to come and talk about the context of security and standards, please do so. Joel, do we have any questions for 32NF?
We have one question here as it relates to SD2110-30 audio. Has there been talk on how to use RFC 5888 in bundling multiple multicasts into one SDP?
I have absolutely no idea, to be perfectly honest. But I'm sure, Joel, if you could send me an email with that one, and if the questioner could drop an email address against it, I know exactly the person to ask, and I should be able to get a response. Hopefully they haven't gone on holiday yet. I should be able to get a response sometime tomorrow.
Very good. I will provide both the email and the question. Thank you.
Thank you
and that's
very much.
all we have for now.
So our penultimate, but by no means second to least favorite technology committee is Media Control Systems and Services, chaired by John Footen and Carl Paulson. And this is the resting home of things like BXF and microservices. So the BXF project, BXF 7.0, is chugging nicely through its publication queue. It's got as far as ST audit, so 2021 parts 1 through 4 should be in the store, I hope, early in the new year, because they've been fairly uncontentious. unlike SMPTE 2071. Now, SMPTE 2071 is a fairly long-standing project from SMPTE called Media Device Control over IP. And anyone who is listening to the Erlangen update will know that we kicked off something in Erlangen to say there's really been no implementations of MDC at all. And whilst it was popular when it was originally proposed, it doesn't look like there's ever going to be any implementations of MDC. It doesn't seem to fit in comfortably with AES-70, nor does it really fit in comfortably with NMOS. However, there's some good concepts and some good work in here. And it would probably make the world a better place if we were to effectively withdraw. In other words, reaffirm and stabilize the document so it was still available in the SMPTE store, but actually we're indicating to the world that no more work's going to take place on this. So anybody who was doing an implementation could come and tell us. Anybody who needs the documents can come and get them, but really we're trying to indicate that we've not really got the traction on this standard, and it's better to put our efforts and to put this technology into somewhere where it's likely to have a life where it will get implemented and will get used. So that's pretty much what we did this time round. We did the review to see if there were implementations, none came forward. We reaffirmed and stabilized the published documents. And part 4, which has never been publicized, we stopped work and we've basically poured concrete on all the work to preserve it. Now, the concepts that are in here, whilst not deployed as SMPTE 2071, might have a really good life somewhere else, particularly in a concept that we've been working on with the AES called the production network, which is a layer where people doing operational activities in media on IP want to have a control plane where they can control routing and switching from a media perspective, not necessarily from a low-level IP perspective. So the goal is to create an ad hoc group called the IP Control Roadmap group to try and look at the current implementations of IP control that are out there, things like NMOS, try and look at the requirements that 2071 was supposed to fulfill and any new requirements coming in, and try and come up with a plan to how to fill that gap. In other words, what do we do with the work that was already done in 2071? How do we make certain that NMOS isn't undermined by any of the work that's done within SMPTE? And moreover, how do we make certain that the work being done in SMPTE really supports the NMOS group, and maybe even at some stage in the future standardize some of the data models to make certain that things are really interoperable, and what can SMPTE do to help? And that's really the goal of this particular piece of work. Last little bit in this committee is media services, media microservices rather. So this is an ongoing initiative that was kicked off about a year ago and has transformed itself a few times. And now the structure looks like a new trade association called the Open Services Alliance, which is a special interest group for media microservices will form. They've identified 3 different subject areas: IMF, status logging, and real-time control. And the goal there is to try and figure out what elements of a media microservice should be standardized or registered or published within SMPTE, and to do some field trials, and then to push that into SMPTE in an appropriate form. That work's just kicking off, and if you're interested in this work, early in the new year we'll talk about a thing called the Open Services Alliance. Search for it on Google, you might just find it. But the goal really is to have that as a feeder organization to get documents into SMPTE that look like implementations are going to be widely supported. Any questions for 34CS?
Let's see. Anthony comes back with, is there any initiative to have the byproducts of the control parameters mirror the metadata of some time that can be contained in MXF, or something that can be contained in MXF, he says?
That is a really good question. And in fact, there is another little group looking at very similar things, which is to do with the control of timeline metadata within MXF. And that's a project that I'm leading with a small German consortium that's not really exposed its work other than at a couple of trade shows yet? And the answer is maybe. It's slightly more complicated than it seems at first touch, but it is very likely that in that ad hoc group and in the media microservices group, that if that is an appropriate solution, then that will bubble to the surface. And at some stage, there'll be a piece of work called MetaRes, will kick off in the 35 PM group, which I'm just about to talk about. And that MetaRes work may well end up being more than just IMF specific, and may well end up being an answer to the question that you have just posed. But as Mr. MXF, that's one of the areas that I'm intimately involved in, and I have my eyes open and my ears open to see if people are interested. So if people want to do that kind of thing, please take part in the 34CS group, or take part in the MetaRes work, which will kick off in 35 PM sometime in January, February, or contact me directly because it's really important, really want that to take place.
And that is the final question for this segment.
Thank you. And in our final technology committee, this is 35 PM, the packaging and interchange TC, which is basically all things IMF. So we're just getting to the end of a major piece of work for the revisions of some of the core documents, which are the core constraints, the CPL, the essence component, application 2E, and application 4. We've been doing all of this work on GitHub. There's been a whole bunch of ballot comments, and those are getting resolved really quickly, and new issues that come up with new documents get put onto the GitHub way of working and get resolved pretty much before anybody knows that they're an issue. So the way of working was initially trialed here. It's worked really, really well. All credit to the technology committee and to the chairs for making this work. These documents are very likely to end up having DP votes and going to the publication queue very, very soon. This one is what's known as being in public CD. So this is a variant on the SMPTE TSP workflow, where when it becomes a committee draft and looks like it's stable, it's put into the public domain to see if there are going to be implementations. So if you're interested in creating IMF assets that have high dynamic range using the hybrid log gamma ITU 2100 approach, then this GitHub repository is available in the public domain. If you just go anonymously to github.com/SMPTE, it'll be one of the ones listed there, and you can download the document, do your implementation of hybrid log gamma, and come along to Plugfests and check that it all works. We encourage you to do that. App 4, which is the archival variant of IMF, they're looking at whether the standard dynamic range digital cinema distribution master can be supported within that particular app, and the answer looks like it's going to be yes. So a new project has been created to do that work. We have a Plugfest DG. The virtual Plugfest for the February physical Plugfest is now underway and will carry on until the end of January. And there's a registration that's open for members on Eventbrite. And if you're not a member of this particular group, please join it on SMPTE OLC. And if you want to attend the Plugfest as a guest, please get in touch with either Thomas or myself, and we can arrange for guest participation to take place. We believe the room will be relatively small. There may be limits to the number of guests we can invite. So if you want to come along as a guest, please do so as soon as possible. And finally, a new, oops, I've gone the wrong way. Finally, a new DG or study group's been created to look at how you create an output profile list to convert IMF into AS11, and they're due to have their first meeting in January. And that concludes our presentation of all the work that's gone on in the TCs. Are there any questions?
Anthony says, well done, and I hope I didn't go on to any of bypass any of your slides. Did I?
No, not at all. Basically, we were just saying, come along to Mumbai and any questions. And I think we've hit the landing point on the 1.5 hour mark. So thank you very much, everyone.
We have just about. Anthony says, well done. If there are any final questions, please type them into the question box quickly, and I will read them. And if there are no questions before everyone heads off and goes away and to whatever they're doing, I want to wish everybody safe travels and happy holidays. Paul says thank you to you and Thomas for the presentation. And I don't see any questions, so I think we should adjourn for well, until next year. We'll come back next year. How's that?
Sounds pretty good to me. And maybe I'll get a new photograph where I've got a bit of a suntan and don't look like I've just sunk a bottle of wine. Maybe I'll use
Photoshop, yeah. Well, thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you to our guests. Safe travels if you are going anywhere. And as I said, wish everybody happy holiday and a joyous new year full of giggles and love and all the good stuff that comes with it.
Right back to you.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye.